My name is Mary Warner. I'm Executive Director at the Morrison County Historical Society. And you can see that we have our lovely brick by brick with an image of bricks, and you can see the same bricks behind me. I literally took the picture from here. Sort of in keeping with our idea of preservation, these bricks are actually salvaged from the old St. Adalbert's Church, and they are being used for our fireplace here at the Charles A. Weyerhaeuser Memorial Museum in Little Falls. I want to welcome everyone here today and our panelists, and we will have Amy Pekarsky from Sourcewell as our moderator, and she will introduce our panelists in just a moment. But I wanted to give everybody a brief introduction here for today's Brick by Brick, Building Community Development Through History Brick 2 panel. It's called Tax Incentives for History, the Importance of Historic Tax Credits. So when we at the Morrison County Historical Society conceived of the Brick by Brick series, we wanted to explore the concept of history serving as infrastructure for the community. We build upon what has happened in the past to create our present and future. Today's panelists in Brick 2 of our series will be talking about how historic tax credits can be used to preserve the built environment in our communities. There's a deeper history infrastructure that supports the use of those tax credits. Communities form heritage preservation commissions and create historic districts, surveys, and design guidelines. Federal and state governments require Section 106 reviews, and property owners nominate their properties to the National Register of Historic Places. History museums and archives around the state provide the repositories of information and photos needed to support these activities. Brick by brick, history serves as the foundation for further community development. And this history infrastructure starts with Native communities. We are living on land in central Minnesota that is the traditional homeland of the Ojibwe and Dakota people. Southern Minnesota is the homeland of the Dakota. There are currently 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota. Their historical use of the land continues to impact land use to this day. So that underlies everything that we're continuing to do now. With that, I want to turn this over to Amy, our moderator, and she will introduce today's panelists.
Thanks, Mary, for the introduction. Today, we have a very committed group of professionals and leaders who have made an impact in their communities and around the state. Their experience will provide some insight and opportunity for you to take back to your own communities. Before I introduce our speakers, though, I want to share just a few housekeeping items. This is part 2 in a 3-part series. This session and the others will be recorded. We ask that everyone use the chat function to ask questions, as we have muted everyone for this session. The chat feature is in the lower right-hand corner, and if there's time, we'll welcome a few questions at the end of each presentation. Otherwise, we have allocated time at the end of the 4 presentations for questions and answers. Our first speaker will be Natasha Wiener. Natasha is a historical architect at the State Historic Preservation Office, reviewing federal and state historic rehabilitation tax credit applications and Section 106 submissions for compliance with SOI standards. She is a registered architect and has a Master of Architecture from the University of Minnesota. Previously, she has worked as a preservation construction project manager, as well as practiced as an architect. Our next speaker is Ethan Booth. Ethan is a real estate manager at Rethos. In his position, he manages Rethos Historic Rehabilitation Loan Program for state historic tax credit rehabilitation projects. The program currently spans 5 states with 42 projects. He also manages the 9 preservation easements Rethos holds on properties throughout Minnesota. Ethan received a BA in art history from St. Olaf College and an MS in historic preservation from Columbia University. Then will be Shannon Weiger. Shannon is a principal at Spring Hill Capital, a company focused on historic and commercial real estate development, where she leads historic tax credit compliance and design. She also owns a consulting and design company, Shannon Weiger & Co. Projects include several of the most significant historic properties in central Minnesota, including the First National Bank of St. Cloud building, which earned the 2017 Top Project Award from Minneapolis Finance and Commerce, and Project of the Year from Preservation Alliance of Minnesota. Shannon was named one of St. Cloud Times' 2018 5 Under 40 Business Leaders in Central Minnesota. She was the Downtown Council's Urban Hero Award recipient for economic impact in 2017 and 2018. She received the City of St. Cloud's Rock On Award in 2018. Shannon is currently an advisor at Great North Labs Venture Fund, a founder of the Greater MN Tech Accelerator, Beta, board member at the Greater St. Cloud Development Corporation, and an advisor at the McNeely Center for Entrepreneurship at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. And our last speaker will be Erin Hannafin-Berg. Erin is a policy director at Rethos, formerly the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota, a nonprofit organization with a mission to lead and inspire people to connect with historic places, promoting community vitality. She earned an MS in Historic Preservation from the University of Oregon and has over 2 decades of professional experience in all aspects of preservation. She has been employed in the public and private sectors as a historic preservation planner and consultant, and she brings a love of historic architecture and a background in research and documentation to her role at Rethos. Erin has led Rethos' efforts in direct project support, outreach, and advocacy since 2008. She now oversees the organization's legislative initiatives with a focus on building support for preservation as a matter of public policy at the statewide level. I will now turn things over to Natasha to get us started.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation here and hope everything goes smoothly. All right. Does that look right to everybody? Okay. I think I saw some thumbs up there. All right. Well, I'm Natasha Wiener, the historical architect for the SHPO office at the Department of Administration. Computer screens are a little weird. Here we go. All right. And I'm here to tell you about the federal tax credit and state tax credit program. The State Historic Preservation Office here in Minnesota administers those programs for the state on the behalf of the federal government, and at least at the beginning of the process. So I wanted to run you through just the basics of it. It's going to have to go real fast, but what essentially what is the credit, who administers the program, and what projects can qualify and how you actually go about applying. So the federal credit is 20% of your rehabilitation expenses. And there is currently a matching state credit. It incentivizes the historic maintaining and historic buildings on the National Register, and specifically to take care of them and make the best choices for them. It's a national program, as you can see here. It goes all the way from New England, taking care of Cape Cods, to shotguns in Louisiana, to our friends in the Southwest. And so the program runs nationally, but in each state, many states have their own state program. Ours is currently sunsetting, and I'm sure you'll hear much more about that as we go by our next speakers. So that is a credit on expenses, and it's awarded after the project is done. It's not like a grant, which is awarded before the project. It's run and administered by partners. Of course, the Internal Revenue Service, which makes sense for a federal tax credit program, the National Park Service, who are the keepers of the National Register, and the State Historic Preservation Office here in Minnesota. There is a state historic preservation office in every state and every district and territory, and that's who helps applicants apply for the program. So we're the eyes and ears on the ground and here to help you. And then we hand the project off for final review to the National Park Service. The Department of Revenue is our partner, as well as we have the state credit program. Ultimately, to qualify for the program, you need to be, the building needs to be on the National Register of Historic Places or in a National Register district. It doesn't need to start there, but it needs, by the end of the project, it needs to be listed in order to receive the credit. It must be a building, which seems kind of obvious in some regards, but there's lots of things on the National Register, including bridges, Jolly Green Giant, boats, things like that, shipwrecks even. But it does need to be a building, which means it needs to be enclosed and essentially have a door to go in it. It must be an income producing property. So that means anything from a retail space to apartments that are rental or offices. It cannot be your home or condos, so multiple condos within a building that are owned by those individuals does not apply, but it does to apartments. It must meet a substantial rehabilitation test set out by the IRS. So the IRS is looking for substantial investment, and we'll run over that, what that means in a little bit. And it must meet the Department of Interior's standards for rehabilitation. And we'll also look at that more closely in just a little bit. So in order to qualify for the program, and this is something very easy for some projects and difficult for other projects, depending on their situation. So you have to meet the substantial rehabilitation test solely based on the qualifying expenses that you have. So those are all capital expenses on the building itself. It's not for acquisition, it's not for landscape, but it is for roofs, HVAC equipment, repointing, all the things that you can think of that you would do in your historic building itself. You'll need the help of a qualified tax professional in order to determine what those expenses are. For some projects, it can be difficult to determine, but many projects it's fairly self-evident. But again, you should talk to a tax professional, and they will help you through that. So it's good to remember that your qualifying expenses, half the test is that you have to exceed essentially the purchase price of your property rather than the market value. So people who've owned their buildings for a really long time can potentially don't have a really high threshold. People who are just purchasing it may have a higher threshold. So it's the purchase price minus the land value plus some additional calculations, but that's just the basics of it. And again, some projects can do a very, very small project because they've owned their building for a substantive time and paid, and their purchase price was much lower. So also, as you saw, the last qualification that we had was meeting the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. And we often talk about just the standards. So the question is, what are the standards and why is the Secretary of the Interior involved? Essentially, we see our secretaries here, our first secretary all the way to our current secretary, but they were developed during Secretary Andrus's time when many countries were looking at different ways of what is the right way to deal with a historic building. And these are the rules that the federal government came up for themselves. And so this is the ones that they are using for the tax program, using federal money to do so. So essentially, there's several sets of standards, but the ones we use for the tax program are the most flexible. And it's essentially focused on often changing the use of the building or making major updates to the building. So they're the most flexible set of standards. And those there's actually 10 standards, but they're very qualitative and they focus on 3 main character things or items. And one is retaining the historic character of the building. One is returning the historic material of the building. And one is when you make modifications, they should be respectful to the historic building and its character. And you can see they're all kind of linked. So decisions that you make on one affect how you treat the other. So if we think about historic character, we're thinking about just the really broad characteristics, sometimes down to the smaller characteristics of the building. Here we can see in the pictures, we know exactly what these buildings are for, and because we can see from the character of their physical presence. So we know this one on the left is a industrial building, and it's probably a warehouse, and we understand that character. Next, we have this very fancy auditorium, which has a highly finished character. And then we have our log structure here on the end, which is clearly somebody's home. It's beautifully crafted, but it's much more straightforward and simple. And so the solutions that you come up with for how you use your historic building are totally based on your historic building. So you're not being held to things that someone would have to do with a fancy theater if you have a warehouse, and you're not having to do warehouse things when you have a lovely log structure. So it's all about your building and what it's like, and we make choices based on that. And of course, here we're allowing the change of use for the building. And so some buildings are much more able to change, like that warehouse is going to be bigger. It's got a lot more space and what's going on. And of course, the finished log structure is kind of tiny. So what can we do with that? That's a good use that makes sense, which is probably a house. Whereas the warehouse can be a warehouse or it could be offices. So there's a lot of choices. And the next one we talk about is historic material. And that is really about the stuff that the building is made of. And so as we can see here, people have, and this is connected to, so we want people to repair the material unless it's beyond repair, because some material can't be repaired, but there's value in the historic material itself. It is what the building is. We consider it to be a physical representation of history. So when you do have to replace and repair, it comes down to what we talked about modifications too. We want to make choices that are appropriate for the building, that are compatible. They should be differentiated as well. But for something like a window, we can see here people have made many choices about what they're going to do and how they're going to place that window. I can tell you there's only one historic window in this group of pictures. And some you can't really tell that they're not the historic ones. Some you can almost tell, and some you're real darn sure those are not the historic windows. And what we want to make sure is then when we're replacing historic material, we're trying to match it closely, as opposed to, say, when we're making additions and modifications to the historic building. And those are going to be all about to make those choices you make about character to make sure it fits in here. Here we see some poor choices that don't really suit the character of the building, and then other ones on the left here that do. So the main question is, how do you actually apply for the program? And it's a three-step process. We have, it's going to be first, it's going to be your project. You're going to run the process. You run the schedule. It's all about your choices in your project. Here, the State Historical Preservation Office, the SHPO office, which you're going to send your applications to, we're here to advise you and guide you, because the final approvers are the National Park Service. They're located in DC, and we're here to help you make sure the application is as good as it can be, so that when it gets to the Park Service, it can be approved. They do approve it with conditions, and so there's different things that may or may not be questions about your project as they go in, but we can all discuss that. It's it's a three-step process. First, it's three parts to the application. The part one is to establish the significance of the building. So this is for buildings that are in districts. We want to make sure that it continues to be contributing to the district, or this is also a time when you can check to make sure that your building is contributing if you're not on the list, on the National Register list yet. The second part is a description of the process. This is when you'll describe the project and we'll determine if it meets the standards. So you'll describe it, you'll submit plans, such things like that, pictures, all sorts of stuff to make sure we understand the project, and that's where we'll communicate about that a lot. The part three is the end of the project when you've completed it. Then there are also amendments in between if you need them, because things always do change. And so the question also is, how do you run a smooth project? Because sometimes people talk about the tax credit process not taking a while, or it's not being smooth. And the best way to go about it is to call us early to make sure that we're working through decisions with you so that you can avoid things that you could have easily changed in the beginning. It's always difficult to change things in the end. And also creative thinking. A lot of people don't think that there's a lot of design choices in preservation. However, there really is. There's a lot to think about. It's all about being a team and getting the project done. And we're very happy to talk to you and visit the site. Not so much in the last year, but usually we love to come visit your site, and we'll be hoping to do that sort of thing soon. And I think that one more thing, there are a lot of resources that you can go to, and that is the National Park Service has a wonderful website which describes the federal program very closely, and how to actually preserve buildings and all sorts of different information about historic buildings, as well as the National Register there too. But you can always give me a call or an email, and we can start a conversation about your building and get you on your way. So, and that is it. And now I need how to unshare.
Well,
Hey, Natasha, this is Mary. I have one question for you.
Yeah.
You know, I sit on the state review board, so we get to read the National Register nominations. And I was just wondering if you could tell folks about how long it takes to put together a National Register nomination. Is there sort of a general guideline so that people start early enough?
Yeah, so one of the main things is, so we think about the tax credit process. The tax credit process is the entire process of your project. The National Register, so we start out often with a part one if your building is not on the National Register, and that gives you a jump start because the National Register process can take, often takes up to a year. And so it's a process that goes through a lot of different approvals. There's a lot of research. So that can take, easily take a year. However, if you are, say, that's if your building is not on the register yet, but if it is on, say, in a district, all you'll have to do for the tax credit program is do a part one, which kind of cribs off the National Register nomination that's already been done. And you can work with that. So that goes a lot more quickly. And I should mention also that all of these applications is part one, part two, and part three. Essentially, we have, when you submit them, we have 30 days to review them. We'll probably ask questions. It may be another 30 days depending on workload, but generally speaking, we're hoping to move people through the process well, as quickly as we can. We're doing that as quickly as we can with the sunset right now. But yeah, so 30 days for each of those items, but they do have to kind of be spaced apart so we do get everything in order. So there you go. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. That totally does. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Natasha. We haven't had any questions come in yet, but if we do, we'll circle back to you at the end of the other presentation. So we will
I may have to step out a little bit early, but I will send a little chat if I do.
Thanks, Natasha. So we'll turn things over to Ethan now.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. I'm going to get my screen shared here in just a second. All right, is this showing up for everyone? All right. Well, my name is Ethan Booty, and I am the real estate manager at Rethos. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how federal and state historic tax credits have been used in small and large communities, mostly focusing on Minnesota here, as that's where Rethos is based, and that's where I believe most people on this session are from. So just a little bit about what I'll be going through. I'll speak a little bit about just Rethos as an organization. My colleague Erin Hannafin-Berg is also here, and I'm not sure how much she's going to go into that. And then I'll go into you know, what historic tax credits, how they're used, which mostly focusing on a higher perspective of this. I know that Shannon will go into more details with some of her project examples. And then also looking at a few project examples throughout the state, and then just taking away some key takeaways of just using using historic tax credits in general. So Rethos, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, 40 years old this year, originally founded as the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota, but recently renamed to Rethos. My position is located within our real estate division, where I manage our historic rehabilitation loan program. which focuses on state historic tax credit projects. It's not limited to Minnesota in particular, although that's where we founded the program, but we have since expanded into 5 states, mostly in the upper Midwest. Historic tax credits. So this is kind of a very vague slide here, but I wanted to go show a kind of an overview about what kind of scales that different tax credit projects are in. You could have anywhere from a $1 million project, which, or even smaller than that, that is using $1 million into qualified rehabilitation expenditures, which Natasha just went over in her presentation. Or you could be upwards of $20 million or more. And those definitely affect how much tax credits actually generated from each project, which is probably obvious. You can do the math yourself with the 20% of the qualified rehabilitation expenditures that Natasha had explained. But most people don't necessarily have the tax credit liability or tax liability to actually make these worth it for themselves, which then creates this market for the tax credits and projects. So looking at the amount of federal and state tax credits that are generated for these projects, you might think of how differently these might be used. For the larger project, there might be, they would most likely be looking for an investor that has $4 million in federal tax credit liability or federal tax liability, and $4 million in state liability. And thinking about how the tax credits can be transferred or in partnership with those investors to be able to make sure that the project can gain the financing and monetize the credits for their use, versus the $1 million project, which might be more creative in how they use their tax credits. People might actually have $200,000 in federal tax liability, and that might kind of change how that's structured, of how an investor might be involved or how they might actually monetize and gain capital for the project to be able to go forward, which all leads to this tax credit market. You may hear a lot about pricing for tax credits. The 20% is, what the IRS actually applies to the project, but it may not be exactly what the amount of money that actually gets injected into the project. I'm sorry for the text-heavy slide here, but I wanted to kind of just do a high view of the timeline for a project as I've experienced. Just thinking about the planning stage is the big part of the project that really obviously sets up for success to be ultimately completed. But there's a lot of things happening simultaneously. You might be looking at a building for a purchase agreement. You might be talking to investors who would be interested in being a partner in the project. You might be meeting and getting quotes for financing or construction loans. You would be talking with architects and consultants, engineers. For tax credits, you'd most likely be working with some sort of historic consultant that would work with Natasha and the SHPO to ensure that the project is meeting the Secretary of Interior standards. There's a lot of market research that might go into it, and local regulations if the project is a building that is also locally designated and might need a building permit through the city, which might require an HPC hearing. All of that kind of goes into the National Park Service application process and applying with the state to get your tax credits going, which, as Natasha said, talking with them early is a really key part to getting these tax credit projects done. That ultimately leads into the construction phase, and there might be things that come up as the construction happens with amendments to your Part 2 application, with things like, you open up a window or you open up a wall and there might be something that you want to change in the design. You'd be constantly working with your architects and SHPO to come up with and respond to these situations. And then ultimately, the placed in service date is a big part of the tax credit process. That's when the project is substantially complete. It may not be completely done with construction, but it's starting to get your tax professional to add up all of your qualified rehabilitation expenditures in order to file your Part 3, which then for the federal credits begins to be able to start claiming those federal credits, and also triggers the creation of a state historic tax credit certificate, which I'll talk about a little bit detail in a second. So federal historic tax credits, it's an income tax credit, and essentially the project has 24 months period, 2 years, to spend qualified rehabilitation expenditures to get the tax credit. There is an option too for a 5-year project or a 5-year phased approach if the project is planning to be done in phases. And that I believe there are a few requirements in order to get that 5-year option. But it's also important to note that, recently, as of 2017, the federal credit is now taken ratably over 5 years. So your 20%, the amount of credit you would get is now, you'd claim that each year, 1/5 of it each year after the project is completed. This, when I was talking with the market, offers opportunities for upfront investment into the project. So you might be talking to an investor that is willing to put forward enough money with the expectation that the tax credits would flow to them after the project is completed. And these might look like banks, local banks, national banks, depending on what the appetite is for them to actually take the tax credits. There might also be a facilitator or syndication, like the National Trust for Historic Preservation actually has a group, the National Community Investment Corporation, that syndicates tax credits for projects, which essentially is a pool of investors that they can facilitate the tax credits to make sure that those investors are getting a return on their investment. Or there might be a more informal agreement with an individual with a high income tax liability. There's many different options here, but this also requires just, the fact that these investors will be interested in how the project gets completed, the stability of the project, the feasibility of it, as well as working with consultants and make sure the tax credits are actually going to be approved through the National Park Service. Or the last option is if the owner of the building actually has the income tax liability to use them. State historic tax credits, at least in Minnesota, we parallel the federal tax credit. So in order to get the state tax credit, you apply for the federal tax credit as well, and then it's automatically applied to your project. It is also a 5-year credit, except rather than just being a literal credit to your income tax, it is certificated and it's refundable, which I can talk about in a second here. This is a little bit different than the federal because of the fact that it has a literal piece of paper that says your amount that you have, which can be transferred to another taxpayer. So in terms of monetizing the actual certificate, you can sell it outright to somebody who has state tax credit to state tax liability using that one transfer. Or you could refund it and get a refund from the Department of Revenue for the amount of the tax credits. There are certain tax implications for doing these, which ultimately talk to a tax professional to figure out what might be right for your project. I can talk a little bit about how Rethos is involved in the state tax credit project process real quick here. As I mentioned earlier in my bio, that we have 45 projects, roughly around 142 million in state historic tax credits that we've had in terms of loans. And we've been working in 5 states, which making an impact through these state tax credits on these projects in these communities has, preserved and created over 3,000 units of housing, most 2/3 of which have had an affordability component. 24 of those were previously vacant and 3.8 million square feet rehabbed, which definitely supports our mission to promote community vitality. Our program works through the state historic tax credit program. We use the one transfer that projects are allotted for their state tax credit certificate to donate it to Rethos. And then we actually refund that with the Department of Revenue in order to monetize the credit and loan that back into the project with favorable origination fees and interest rates in order to get the most value out of their state historic tax credit. We have a few terms for it, one of them being that they must pay for or reimburse the cost of rehabilitation expenditures. And then after 5 years, we offer the option to purchase the note at fair market value. And then here's just a quick overview of the loan details for our own personal program, which is my expertise, obviously, in the tax credit realm. But it's a 40-year amortization, 0.1% interest rate, 2.5% origination fee, and then we have a public benefit fee that goes towards our education services and legal fees that we ask our borrower to cover for us. And then just in terms of what the timeline I showed you earlier, we're involved mostly in the planning process of the project, and then we actually fund our loan after completion. As I said, the certificate is transferable once, so we have to wait for the certificate to be in our hands in order to actually have the money to fund our loan. This prompts the developer or the project owner to bridge the financing for construction, usually a short-term high-interest loan that gets repaid with our loan. I kind of had these here just as references if there's any questions, but just in terms of what I was talking about with getting an investor involved in the process, just kind of the overview of what that might look like visually. But the historic tax credits would go to an investor, while the money from those tax credits up front would go into the partnership agreement with the developer or owner of a project. And in terms of just how Rethos might fit into a project, you kind of split those up into federal and state, and then our money would be loaned into the project this way. I also have this more complicated one. There are certain tax benefits and I believe depreciation benefits for using this structure, but it's essentially the same thing with historic tax credits going to an investor and money going into the project, just a different way to structure it, usually for larger projects. But then Rethos would fit into that fairly similarly to the past one. I have a few project examples here, one of them being the Press House in St. Paul. This is one of the larger projects that Rethos is actually a part of in terms of the state historic tax credits. As you can see, roughly $15 million in tax credits were generated from this project, and it created 144 affordable studio 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. This is one of the important things about the key takeaways of this program. Is that there's a building that is vacant in downtown St. Paul, located on a light rail, located within the Skyway system, that is ripe for development opportunity. And the fact that it is a historic building, it was one of the first buildings to be constructed after World War II in downtown St. Paul, made it feasible to rehab into these nice apartments, mostly because of the ability to gain access to these almost $15 million to rehab the building. And as you can see, you have the nice apartments on the right there. Another example, a little bit of a smaller project, is that you may be been familiar with this if you are from the city's area, but the Keg and Case and Rathskeller projects, they're actually two separate applications for the same general complex, formerly the Schmidt Brewing Company, but roughly getting $3 million each for their tax credits in order to make this formerly vacant building into a community asset. As you can see, there's an event going on. There's 23, I believe, different food vendors, as well as a brewery on the second level. Definitely a great community asset for them. Another example in a smaller community up in Cloquet, Minnesota, the former Cloquet Middle School was recently, I believe, opened last year to start leasing, but 57 units of housing, with 80% of those being specific for workforce housing, and roughly about $5 million in tax credits for that. And there's certain quirky things that were preserved as a part of the building. As you can see on the right, this is, I believe, the former art room that they had kept one of the pillars that had different art projects from over the years at the middle school. And there's also, they kept the lockers as well as chalkboards and certain elements of the historic buildings as a part of the rehabilitation process. And then finally here, if it loads, which Aaron will show you a video shortly about this. The Ely State Theater, one of the smaller projects that Rethos has been a part of, only getting around $740,000 in historic tax credits, both federal and state. But as you can see, made it work for them to rehab a beautiful community asset. There's a theater that can host live performances, community events, as well as show movies. There's an Airbnb in the apartment behind the marquee, as well as an adjacent building that was not a historic tax credit project, but hosts a second theater and concessions and room for businesses and offices. And this is one of the ones that it's important for how these projects actually impact communities too, of how this can be an anchor to downtowns around the state and bringing people downtown, creating a strong commercial core, as well as having just a really important place that holds a lot of memories of the community to back to life and back into service again. So a few key takeaways from this presentation. One of the things I want to emphasize is that your team is very important when going through a historic tax credit project. Having the right tax professional, having the consultants, having potentially investors that are involved in, or at least learning and open to learning about historic tax credits. You don't have to be an expert in them already. You can definitely learn, and you can definitely, get your hands dirty learning about how this might work for you and your community, and making sure that whatever types of arrangements you might have, whether that be really formal arrangements with a bank or a syndication firm, or more informal arrangement with a community partner or neighborhood group, making sure that those are really strong going forward. There's also another thing that I want to emphasize too, is that there's a lot of opportunities for other layering with forms of financing like new market tax credits, low-income housing tax credits. There might be some local economic development incentives. Historic tax credits also work well within opportunity zones, which I believe the National Trust has a map of National Register properties and opportunity zones that you can check your local area to see what properties might be on that. But this is a really key part of that. They're very easy to layer with other parts of a project's financing. And then the last thing is that this is incentivizing private investment. So while there might be added costs to getting these projects done, like hiring consultants and working through the Secretary of Interior standards with the consultants, the credits really push the project to a point that they are economically feasible for private commercial development. With that, I believe I am finished, and I will hand it off to Amy again.
Well, thanks, Ethan. Just to keep us close on schedule, we're going to go right to Shannon. We did have a few questions come in, but we'll circle back to those at the end. So Shannon, we'll hand it over to you.
Hold on here. All right, is that working? All right, hi everyone. My name is Shannon Weiger, and I am here to tell you that these projects can be done. And I was very overwhelmed when I first watched all of the squares with the different investors and the tax credits and all of that. But I cannot tell you how much these opportunities have benefited our community and me personally and our group. That's really found out how to leverage these credits and all of the great groups across Minnesota to save some of these historic buildings. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share a little bit with you. All right. So a little bit about me and who I'm not really. I'm not what I would call a developer, even though that's what I was introduced as, and I guess I am. But really, my day job is business development director at a Minneapolis-based law firm. And working on these development projects is really just a passion of mine. I grew up wanting to be an archaeologist. I've always loved design. I've always loved architecture. And I've always loved history and think it's really important to not only save these buildings, but take a few lessons from the craftsmanship and the sacrifices that went into creating these spaces in the first place. So I was just lucky enough to meet people along the way that were doing some of this work, and we realized we each brought a unique skill set to the table. And so I think we're on our 9th or 10th historic renovation now. And it's really been a fun journey for me over the last decade. But this here is a picture of my family who I drag into these projects with me. It's my husband, Nick, and I have twin boys and my daughter, Anne. And this is a project I'll tell you about. But long story short, I went to school at St. Ben's, and this building sits on the corner in St. Joe. And I was so sick of looking at it. It was so ugly. It was right on the corner. It was just a disaster. Revolving door of businesses. And so one day I was playing at the park with my kids and saw the woman in the boutique putting a going out of business sign up, which is sad. Went over and talked to her a little bit, and then she gave me the number for the building owner, and I called him and just bought it really without doing any sort of inspection or anything. I'm a little crazy like that, but I knew that this building had potential. So that's a little bit about me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the very first historic tax credit projects we did, which is this building. It's the Bank of St. Cloud building. It's in downtown St. Cloud, right on the corner, beautiful building, and was owned by the group that actually has the bar and restaurant in the basement. And they realized that it was just too big of an animal for them. It's a very large building, very old building, very beautiful building. And so they wanted to put it in the hands of someone or a group who could take this on. And so we'd never done a tax credit project. We knew that we needed to figure it out in order to make this project work. And we're all kind of roll up our sleeves sort of people. And so we assembled a group to take on this project. I had the fortunate or unfortunate task, I guess, of managing the tax credit process. So Natasha, bless her heart, walked me through that whole process and was so patient with me, answered all my questions, helped us at every step of the way. We really didn't know entirely what we were doing. We had great construction partners. We had really talented architects, and we had great tax advice. And we were able to really teach ourselves this process and work through it just with the local resources. And again, with SHPO, it was really fantastic. And so the cool part about this entire project is this building went from a complete eyesore, and it was vacant, to this beautiful shining example in our community. And it's fully leased. And it was actually, before we finished, a new bank, or they were an existing bank, but they came new into the St. Cloud market. So it was very exciting. The Greater St. Cloud Development Corporation, the Initiative Foundation, and then the bar and grill that were in the basement. So this building really made a lot of news in St. Cloud. It got a lot of press. People were really excited, and it spurred a lot of additional economic development around it. So I always love pictures. Here's a couple before and after photos. And like I said, this building was certainly a mess. Lots of bad decisions over the years. Drop ceilings over original plaster pillars. Don't really know why anyone would do that, but it was done all over this building. Great opportunity to meet amazing craftspeople from all over the state of Minnesota who really, this is an art. Restoring these buildings is certainly not easy. So that's another really rewarding part of this process. It's really bad. It's actually shocking for me to look back at some of these pictures sometimes. Oops. And one of the unique features that we uncovered was this vault that was hidden behind this wall. And the ceiling was still there. We had incredible newspaper articles that talked about this vault. There was actually a bedroom behind this vault where the teller used to sleep in the evenings because there were so many bank robberies. It's quite incredible what you can find online, but we were able to save elements of the vault, which was really neat. So once we wrapped up the Bank of St. Cloud building, this poor, really ugly building was right next door to it. And so once we'd gone through the tax credit process, we knew that we could do it again. And we're thrilled to be able to take on the Whitney Lands Company building. So you can see the progression back to how it originally looked, as close as we could get. This building still had quite a few historic elements in it and was really, really quite beautiful. Here's Anne and Owen in front of one of the original vaults that's still in the building. The neat part about this building too, which has really become a theme when we do these projects, JLG Architects, who is our architect, a nationally recognized regional architect in the Midwest, decided to open a new office in the St. Cloud market and is housed in this building. So they're our architect in all these projects and also are in this building. So that was really exciting. And then just recently as well, a new art gallery is going to be opening in the space. So two things that had never existed in St. Cloud: businesses, jobs, come because of these buildings. They're no longer blighted and forgotten. So it generates a lot of revenue for the city. So here's a before and after. It was a hoarding situation, certainly, when we acquired it. And this building was not hard. It was basically just taking away all the bad decisions and letting the historic features shine through. Two other past projects I wanted to mention were the Davidson Opera House and the Benson Brother Building in downtown St. Cloud. So here's quite a before and after picture of this block in St. Cloud. And this was really the gateway into downtown. It's what everyone saw when they were entering. And again, just awful. And it is beautiful now. So that's been a really rewarding project. And now it's a beautiful gateway into downtown, which we really appreciate. It is fully leased as well, so that's exciting, and with really great businesses. All right, so next, this is the St. Joe building that I was telling you about in St. Joseph, Minnesota, right on the corner. And this building could not have been any uglier. It was actually uglier than these photos, which you'll see in the next photo. That's it. I mean, you've got it all. You have 70s brick, stucco, eyebrows, shingles. So basically ripped that all off except for the historic brick. And this is the picture you can see is how it originally looked. So I have this amazing tuck pointer that we work with, and he is going to hopefully get the front looking as close to original as possible. So we've been putting in new windows. We have the new brick in, all ready to roll. So we're very excited about this project. And it's been really interesting in St. Joe. People are blown away. I actually had to get a second phone number because so many people were calling me wanting to lease space in this building. And it's just really exciting because constantly, it's actually hard for me to go there and get anything done because people are constantly stopping and asking. So it's been a great opportunity to meet everyone, and I can already see other things happening in town. It's just when there's an opportunity to raise the bar a little bit, try something new, then other people want to join in and everyone wants to work together, and they start asking, how did you do that? You know, who are you working with? So it's been really fun. And certainly on this building, there was zero historically significant features remaining, literally none. So we allowed some natural light into the building, and it's going to be a boutique. Very excited. It'll be completed on June 1st. And then there's 5 St. Ben students that lease the lofts upstairs. So it's a really, really fun project. It's my kids. I enjoy making them work on these projects too. It's fun for them to be a part of it as well. So what have I learned through all of this? I have learned that as much as I would love to spend every day fixing old buildings and restoring and making them beautiful, it doesn't pay the bills. Certainly these buildings have to make financial sense. And that's why these partnerships are so critical in understanding how to leverage some of the incentives that are out there to make these projects a reality. The city of St. Joseph, for example, is very interested in how did St. Cloud do this? You know, how can we educate business owners? What can we do to let people know that these opportunities are out there? And to be totally honest, without the tax credits, we would not have taken on the Whitney building or the Bank of St. Cloud building. It was just not even feasible. And I talked a bit about this, but I'm not trained in grant writing. I'm not trained in architecture, formally design, tax credits, none of that. But again, with Rethos and Shippo and all the great people, these projects can be done. It's just about rolling up your sleeves and knowing where to go for help. And then, you know, this one is obvious, but the impact is truly undeniable. These projects, especially in downtown St. Cloud and in St. Joe, they get attention because people genuinely love history. They're like, oh, my grandpa used to go to that bank, or, you know, I remember this. So the stories that come in and people get excited, and then they drive by and then they stay for dinner or go shopping. Maybe they're inspired to open their small business. It just really generates a lot of revenue, obviously, for the city, but also for all the businesses around it. So it's been really a great community building experience too. And nothing makes me happier than to see a small business go into these historic buildings, because that's how they started. I mean, these were the people that built our communities 100 years ago. So that's what's really special to us with these projects. And then on that note, three fun things that happened, or 2 fun things out of these projects. So the first, the lights that you can see there, we had someone come forward, a business owner, Bernie Perryman, and she loves history, loves downtown, and knew that we needed to continue to build this momentum downtown. And I had this dream of stringing lights across our downtown. I just wanted to pull people in. We had all these beautiful buildings, and a lot of people were just missing it, especially with all the renovation work that had been done. And so she said, I'll pay for them. And she did. And the city was wonderful. They worked out the easements. We had an engineering company. Everyone volunteered their time and got these lights up. And it was just ahead of COVID, which was a beautiful thing, because we all spent so much more time outside with outdoor dining. So that was a really special thing that came out of all of this community work and restoring our downtown. And then the other 2 photos are of a gentleman who stopped me in St. Joseph, and he told me he owned the building. It's right on Main Street. It's a total disaster. It was built during the Civil War, and actually those are newspapers from the Civil War that are covered in Mod Podge all over the walls in that house. And he said, I don't know what to do, and I don't know how to save this. I feel terrible. I don't know what to do. And so it was an opportunity to connect him with some people who could step in and save this building, because if it went another year or 2, it was coming down. So my point is that these projects just pull people in, and once the ball starts rolling, it doesn't stop. So we've appreciated Rethos and Shippo and everyone certainly on this call. So just wanted to say thank you for being a part of it and being able to share.
Well, thank you, Shannon. Those are some amazing before and after pictures. We will turn things over to Erin. And then just a reminder to keep sending your questions in after Erin's presentation. We're going to circle back to all the questions that have come in so far.
Okay, let me see if I can get my screen shared. Is that working? So I'm going to go back here to to. There we go. Okay. So I am here today to talk primarily about the Historic Tax Credit Coalition that we have built at Rethos with a number of partners. And as Natasha had mentioned several times, this magic word sunset that is not as romantic as it sounds. It's actually kind of a scary thing for those of us who are involved in the state historic tax credit world. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And some of the work that we have been doing as an advocacy coalition, and then hope to get you on board with this. So first of all, I want to kind of show you the national landscape of states that have state historic tax credits. As Ethan mentioned, and as Natasha mentioned, this is a program that has to be paired with an existing federal historic tax credit, which again is an income tax credit worth 20% of the qualified rehabilitation expenses. In Minnesota, our state historic tax credit mirrors that 20%. Not all of the states that have historic tax credits at the state level have that same percentage. Some of them only offer a small amount. Some of them are much more robust and offer 25 or 30% of a state income tax credit to pair with a federal credit. Some of them offer credits for residential properties, so owner-occupied historic houses can be rehabilitated using their state tax credits. But in Minnesota, ours is tied specifically to the use of the federal historic tax credit, and it has all the same rules, essentially. Some of the gray states that you see on this particular map, some of those states don't have income taxes. And so it's really hard to offer an income tax credit when you don't actually collect income taxes. So that's some of the reason why we still have a few places that have not yet adopted state or historic tax credits. But we can see that this is very broadly accepted historic rehabilitation policy, and it makes a lot of economic sense for all the people involved. But when Minnesota and the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota, as we used to be called, first started advocating for the historic tax credit, this was in the 1990s. We actually had led an 11-year advocacy effort to try to get our state historic tax credit in place. And all of these states that have X's on them actually did not have historic tax credits at that time. So back in 2010, when our state tax credit was passed, we had a number of other states that were trying to get the same thing accomplished. There's both an X and a plus on the state of Michigan, because Michigan had a historic tax credit at the time that we were advocating for ours. Then they lost their historic tax credit for 5 or 6 years, and they just this year were able to get it back. So as our economy was recovering from the Great Recession, which is one of the things that really motivated the institution of our state historic tax credit, Michigan was really suffering by not having that tool available to them, and really had to claw their way back from an advocacy standpoint to get it up and operational again. But here's kind of the short stats on our state historic tax credit. It was enacted in 2010. We really used the Great Recession as one of the motivating factors for getting policymakers on board with this really, really vital tool to rehabilitate historic places. We worked with the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office, which at that time was at the State Historical Society, and also with a group called the Building Jobs Coalition. This was a lot of the largest labor unions in the state that worked on construction projects, a lot of construction contractors and some developers, architects, and engineers. All of those folks had been really reeling from really vast unemployment numbers during the Great Recession. And so they backed our effort, and that was part of the way that we were able to make a strong case for it at the state capitol. And as I said, it was the culmination of an 11-year advocacy effort on our part as a nonprofit organization. And when that tax credit was passed in 2010, the initial sunset date was 2015. The legislature likes to put kind of firm end dates on programs, especially on tax expenditures, so that they can evaluate whether or not these programs and this outlay of state money is reaching the goals that they had in mind at the time. And so that initial sunset date was 2015, but we were able to return in 2013 point to the first couple years of data, an impact from the historic tax credit, make a case for it being extended, and it was bumped out to this date that is looming, looming, which is just June 30th of 2021. That's 83 days from now. So we knew that we had our work cut out for us as an advocacy coalition to make a strong case for renewing this. And now we are racing against the clock and all of the other things that the legislature needs to decide to make sure that we can have this historic tax credit extended before it goes away for good and we're in a situation like Michigan. So as I mentioned, we have a historic coalition. One of the things that we've been at the Capitol the last several years, we have been advocating for this. It's something that we knew was coming up fast. And we're building a case for the historic tax credit to be extended. But then of course, we know what happened with COVID and all of the new things that the legislature had to be focusing on instead. And so we thought it was really important to make sure that we had a strong coalition of partners that could help us tell this story in new ways and really compelling ways. And so we have built this coalition organized by New History and Winthrop and Weinstein and Rethos. And then we have brought a whole bunch of other development and sponsor partners on board, developers and contractors, specialty contractors, architecture firms, historical consultants. A whole bunch of folks are involved in helping lead this forward, and we literally could not do this work without them. So there's a whole legislative strategy to this work that we've been doing, right? So, excuse me. One of the things that is challenging about the historic tax credit is back in 2010, when we were first advocating for it, it was a jobs bill. We were pointing out that this is going to put people back to work. It's going to revitalize industries. It's going to create new investment opportunities and new opportunities for small businesses to grow in communities all across the state. People really recognize that this is a jobs creation bill. But once it's set up in tax policy, the place where it has to get reviewed periodically is in the taxes committee. And so it's out of that jobs building piece and really into the nuts and bolts of tax credit or tax policy. So we have been meeting with the senators and House of Representative members that are on the taxes committees. This is kind of a snapshot of who they are. Normally, this is the kind of thing that we would be doing in person at the Capitol, but we don't have that opportunity, obviously, during COVID. So we've been lining up virtual visits with them and making the case for tax credits. Some of the stuff that we're sharing with them are these one-pagers that have been designed by our communications consultant firm that we've hired. And it talks about what the investment is in terms of the impacts of the historic tax credit. And this is all stuff that is drawn from the annual economic impact studies that are required as part of our state statute. The SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, does these in partnership with the University of Minnesota Extension Office. They have the extension economists work on this, and they help to demonstrate how much money is going into these projects and then how much that circulates in the economy and what the actual impact is. So we know, for example, in greater Minnesota that some of the projects have had up to $16 in return on investment, essentially, from every dollar that's been awarded in projects in greater Minnesota. Over $176 million was dedicated or created in economic impact from projects that were approved just within the last fiscal year. We've seen a lot of growth in property taxes, and of course that means extra local dollars that can go to funding infrastructure and schools and local services. And then over the life of the program to date, there's been $3.5 billion in economic activity that's resulted specifically from the activity in this historic tax credit. Lots of jobs created, 18,000 plus jobs. And we've had, there's been, I think, 144 projects that have been approved for use of the historic tax credit since 2011. In the whole statewide average, we see typically a $9 plus economic impact for every dollar created. So it's been great to look at some of the data and to see that there has been an extra special boost in greater Minnesota where the dollars tend to go farther, and those local jobs are even more impactful. And then we've also, demonstrated that there's a statewide impact to this with that statewide map that had those little houses or buildings all across it. But in the downtowns of Minneapolis and St. Paul and Duluth, now in Winona, we can see more of a concentration of historic resources just because of the density of historic places. Plus, these are pretty big projects typically, and need a lot of investment, and that's been driven mostly by our urban areas. But there's definitely statewide impact to this. One of the things that we've also been focusing on a little bit is really recognizing what the business development opportunities are within historic downtowns, and at all scales. So, newer and smaller businesses tend to gravitate towards historic buildings. There's a lot more immigrant entrepreneurs, people of color, women-owned businesses are proportionately more likely to locate in some of these older areas of our cities and communities. And it also has a much more cross-generational use. So there's a report that was done several years ago by the National Trust for Historic Preservation called Older, Smaller, Better, that helps illustrate all of these points. And we think it's something that's really going to drive Minnesota's economy forward, especially as people are used to working remotely and can be all across the state, including in more rural areas. So there have been bills to extend the historic tax credit at the state level that have been introduced this session, both in the House and in the Senate. You can see the bill authors here. We are really proud of having a very bipartisan statewide slate of bill authors on both the House and Senate bills. And both of these were heard in the taxes committees and in the respective bodies. So the House Taxes Committee heard this bill back in February, and the Senate Taxes Committee had actually heard it the week before. And great to get those legislators familiar with it. And then we're very pleased to say that the House Omnibus Tax Bill that was just released earlier this week does include a state or a sunset extension for state historic tax credit that would be for 8 years, so till 2029. Our executive director, Dr. Heidi Swank, was on the hearing just yesterday via Zoom, obviously, and was able to thank the chair and the committee for including that in the omnibus tax bill. And that is definitely a really strong step forward. And so we are part of the way there. But we really need to start reaching the Senate and making sure that we're included in the Senate bill. There's been a lot of local press that we have tried to spur so that people are talking about this locally, and that the senators all across the state and representatives as well, but especially Senate now realize that this is something that their constituents value and want to see move forward. Heidi was down in Rochester just last week to talk about the historic tax credit, and there was a local news segment on the chair of the Senate Taxes Committee, Senator Carla Nelson, is from Rochester. So, part of this, again, as we're meeting with taxes committee members and we're lining up our bills, we're also trying to meet the people who are in leadership positions where they are and where their constituents are and help them drive that, that decision making forward. I want to share with you one of the videos that we have. This is just my placeholder. So now I got to figure out how to unshare my screen and go back to another screen, if I can do that. Sorry to muddle through this, but I don't have multiple monitors at home. So let me find, okay, so now I'm going to share this one. Optimize, hold on one moment. I think I am good here. I can see Ethan. So Ethan, will you give me a big wave if you can hear this when it starts playing?
When you drive around greater Minnesota and you see those old historic main streets, there's something special. So much of what we try to do in economic development and growth perspectives is looking at job creation. And the Simon Warehouse is a prime example. You have a project like this that ultimately brings construction jobs, but the spin-off of these projects and what that means to a variety of different industries and kind of marketplaces is very, very impactful. This was, in our sense, is a catalytic project for our downtown growth.
When we talk about historical tax credits, you're talking about revitalizing the character of a city or a space, and you're talking about the historical importance of a building. And to me, not only is it like storytelling, but it's also about the heritage.
Our development community is small. We're not attracting national developers or even broad-scale regional developers. These are people right in our backyard that are making this investment in our community. I think if the historic tax credits were to sunset and it wasn't to be extended, you would see less businesses or developers take a chance. Having access to historic tax credits is one of the only reasons why this project and others happen across the state.
Alrighty, so that's an example of the kind of video content that we've been putting together to try to make sure that we are reaching out to the folks that really need to hear from their constituents, or activate those folks that need to speak up. So one of the ways that you can get more information about all the work that we're doing here is through social media, and especially as the legislative session goes on, there is news is going to move at the pace of social media. It's not necessarily going to all be shared through traditional media sources like TV and newspaper. But we've got a Facebook page set up for Revitalize MN, the coalition. We're on Instagram. You can see that we have this, graphic. We're in the Minnesota House bill. Are we going to be in the Minnesota Senate bill? We're not quite sure yet, but we really need your support to make sure that senators know this is something that people value and are expecting to see extended. And then Twitter is where all of the political stuff happens, right? In the last 6 weeks or so that we have left of the legislative session, this is where the politicians are continuing to push their agendas and their priorities. And we need to be able to be present on Twitter to make sure that they are hearing from our constituents as well, and hearing from our stakeholders. There's also a page, and I think Ethan just shared it in the chat, where you can find information on how to engage directly with legislators. There is an advocacy tool set up for you to just plug in, and I think this is a screenshot of it. It's just a really brief statement that says this is what you support. You can add a little personal message in that thing if you have a local example that you want to highlight, and it talks about why that's so important. There's both a petition as well as an automatic email sender that you can send. And then here's that sunset extension language that just shows that it's been extended, or it's proposed to be extended for 8 years. And we, as I said, think that that's a great position in the House bill, but we really need to get in the Senate bill and or have a way to leverage this in a conference committee when it comes down to them working out the final details. And yes, we are waiting to find out. We'll know next week whether or not the draft Senate omnibus bill includes the historic tax credit sunset extension, and then we'll have a much better sense of like what the work is ahead of us. I also want to mention just briefly that there's a federal Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act. They call it HTC GO. That has been reintroduced in Congress. And this is something that is specifically set up. Sorry that this is not the best slide to read, but it talks about what the benefits of tweaking the federal program would be, and it offers a temporary boost as part of a pandemic relief thing, for example. So it would boost the tax credits to 30% up until 2024, and then ramp down back to the 20% at the federal level. It also makes smaller projects more viable. So one of the things that we're recognizing, and Shannon could certainly attest to this, is it's a little bit harder to get the capital together up front for doing smaller projects if you don't have those investment channels kind of already greased. And so this would reduce the basis that how much of the money you have to spend on rehabilitation. It would also make a permanent 30% historic tax credit available for projects that are under $2.5 million in qualified rehabilitation expenses. And it also changes some of the IRS rules to allow for nonprofits to be able to use the tax credit more easily for the use of the building. So when you get the slides of this, you can read this more clearly, and there will be more information, I'm sure, that we will post on our Rethos website about this. But it's the kind of thing that will really position our state historic tax credit to really make a huge and much more broad impact in greater Minnesota if this federal legislation goes forward. And it had been included in the bill that passed Congress last summer. So we have every expectation that it will be included in the Biden administration's infrastructure bill that's going to be, worked on over the coming summer. So here are some of the links to the extent that you need any of these, and you can certainly contact me for more information or if you need tips on how to advocate. And I know that you've been wanting to save a little time for question and answer at the end. So I will stop talking now, if that's okay.
Well, thank you, Erin. I know we're coming close to our end time, but if people have to drop off, that's fine. But we will circle back to those questions that we did have come in. So the first one came in was for Ethan. Can public properties benefit from tax credits? Is this true even if the project uses state money to help fund the restoration?
So it depends kind of how they structure it. I believe a city, if they form like a community development entity, can get the benefits of the tax credits for a project led by that, but they can't necessarily be used by the city themselves or a public entity, like a college or it has to be for a income producing purpose. So they can't necessarily be for, it could be for like housing and other, business ideas, but I kind of jumped around there a little bit. The answer is like it's a little bit complicated, but for most projects, it's still private investment and private developers that are making these projects happen.
And there's one more question for Ethan, so don't unmute or don't mute yourself just yet. Are there limitations or barriers to using historic and affordable tax credits together in the same project? And are you seeing more commercial to residential conversions than in the past?
So I'm not as familiar with like the low-income housing tax credit like process, but from our perspective at Rethos, at least the projects that I've been involved in, there haven't been any issues with doing those simultaneously. I know that they're a little bit more competitive and that there's like a competition aspect of getting low-income housing tax credits allocated to your project. But the state tax credit is completely separate in terms of like what is reviewed and how that gets administered. And I believe that for it does change a little bit of the timeline for the project, because for low-income housing tax credits, I believe it's 15 years that they have to own the project, versus for historic tax credits, it's usually 5 years, which is the I didn't mention this in my presentation, but there's a recapture period for tax credits that for 5 years the project has to have this period of time to make sure that they're in compliance. That's usually when the project refinances and a developer would get out of the project. But that's a little bit different for low-income housing. But I am seeing a lot of commercial to housing development. I know that they're not always tax credit projects too. I know downtown St. Paul has had a couple different projects come forward in some of the old office towers that are vacant that are being converted into housing. So I'm excited to see some of those projects go forward too. But I'm not sure if there might be other input from other panelists about this too.
Well, thank you, Ethan. Did any of the other panelists have anything to add to Ethan's response to either question? Erin or Shannon? Otherwise, our next question was for Shannon. Shannon, how do you find contractors who can do the historic preservation work?
That's a great question. SHPO was certainly helpful in there's lists certainly of approved folks, but a lot of it is asking around. I was fortunate to have a good friend, and one of my partners in the Bank of St. Cloud project actually owned a construction company, and they have done some historic renovation projects at St. Cloud State. So we are fortunate to have some of those connections, but honestly, finding people who can do some of the plaster work, I mean, it is just calling and asking. There's no magic to it. It's a lot of emails and phone calls and research and Googling, and then making sure that those people are experienced and appropriate for the task.
Thanks, Shannon. This question came in just at the end of your presentation, so if you can answer it, we'll have you answered. Otherwise, maybe somebody else can help too. I would be interested in what the total funding picture looked like going into the project, and then how long before the renovation was paid for.
Oh, I mean, you could look at that 10 different ways. So we financed the Bank of St. Cloud project with traditional financing, and then individually took the tax credits. So I don't know if that answers the question. And then we have tenants, but the building is certainly not paid off yet. I'm not sure if that's the question at hand here, but I will say, it is a balance of figuring out who your tenants are going to be, and knowing that early into the process is also helpful, and how that picture looks, because it isn't always easy to balance the requirements and doing things that are historically appropriate and correct with the building with some of the things that tenants want. They want modern glass walls and crazy carpets and all sorts of things, and acoustics and IT equipment. All of these things are complicated. So as Natasha said, identifying the tenant early, that helps you understand your cash flow picture and all of that. So it is complicated from that perspective, but it's, I don't know how else to answer it, but each project's differently. But when you use the tax credits and you have a tax professional, you have to understand too how your money is going to come out. As Ethan mentioned, you need to make sure that you can actually capture the credits, that each person that has ownership in the building or is planning to capture the credits, that you can actually do that. So there's a lot of pieces to think about, and it is complicated. But again, this is something that we were able to figure out, and I'm happy to help anyone through it from the developer perspective.
Thanks, Shannon. I think that was a very encompassing answer for that. Our last question is for Aaron. How is the economic impact data gathered, and then who puts these studies together?
Yeah, so the impact, the annual, and I don't think we have Natasha on the call anymore, but when the applicant applies for using the historic tax credits and is submitting their part 1 and part 2 to the state, they have to kind of like guess at how much the budget will be. And from that, they figure out what the amount of the qualified rehabilitation expenses will be. And then of course there's 20% of that is used as the amount that the tax credit would earn. And then there's a economic formula that the folks at the U of M Extension, Bridget Tuck is the real expert in this, and she has done all these economic analyses. And she puts it into an economic modeling software or formula, discounting things like the value of the land. There's no actual economic benefit that comes from transferring land from one person to another. And but the actual money that's going in to rehabilitating the project does have some kind of modeling that they can do to it. And so they figure that out based on like, this is how much actual costs there are. And these costs, when those wages and tax, sales taxes and things like that, all of that stuff is circulating in the economy. That's what creates this economic impact. So I'm not going to be able to explain it because I'm not an economist, but if you look at the way that the annual impact statements or studies are generated, it's very, very clear and easy to understand, and there's really great data in there. The other thing is, back to like, not from Shannon's perspective in terms of like when does the project pay for itself, but we know some data about when the projects pay for themselves in terms of the state's investment in it. And back to that, like $1 in state credits generates $9.50 in economic activity. It also generates a whole lot of local properties and state taxes. And so they can like look at what the payback period is for those individual projects, and they've modeled those in a few examples as case studies. And so we know, for example, one of the projects that they highlighted in downtown Minneapolis paid back more than half of it, what it's going to be allowed in tax credits, just through the construction phase, through those state and local tax increases, and then had completely paid for the state investment within 7 years. So it's a great return on investment for the state.
Well, thank you, Erin. And that wraps up the questions that we had come in. So I'm going to hand things over to Mary to close things out for the day.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy. I want to thank all of our presenters, Natasha, Ethan, Shannon, and Erin today. Our moderator, Amy Pekarsky, who's from Sourcewell. Also, Anne-Marie Johnson, who really did a ton of behind the scenes work here, getting all speakers together. Grace Duxbury, she's our museum assistant, and she has helped out with things here. And then Phoebe Ward, who is the City of Little Falls Fellow right now. She's been helping with some of the communications aspect of this, as well as Ashley Zeiden, who was Amy's compatriot at Sourcewell till just recently. So she really helped us get going with this as well. I want to thank all of our attendees today, and we hope that you will start talking about using history as part of the infrastructure of our communities. And we also hope that you will join us for next week's Brick 3, which is about history as infrastructure. So we're going to wrap this all up so that you can head on with your day. We just a little bit over, but I think it went very, very well. So thank you, everybody.